Hello, and welcome back to another presentation from Straight Talk about PTSD. This presentation is entitled PTSD Never Travels Alone. We've already explored how an overaccumulation of living memories of attachment trauma, sexual and physical abuse, rape, combat, severe accidents, and the like often result in PTSD, insecure attachment, hyperarousal, hypofrontality, and an overly powerful low-road brain. Too often, the net result of all of this is loneliness, alienation, and a constant sense of stress and danger, anxiety and depression, and an emotionally and interpersonally unrewarding life. The constant stress, ever-hovering negative emotions, and perceived aloneness affect virtually every aspect of life. Not surprisingly, insecure attachment and PTSD are together associated with over 4 dozen other mental and physical health conditions. One mechanism we have not spoken of at length bears mentioning before we go into those specific conditions, because it's directly affected by both hyperarousal and living trauma memories, and that is sleep. While we're going to cover attachment, trauma, and sleep more fully in a later presentation, looking at some of the basics of sleep science now may shed light on how the stress chemistry of hyperarousal actually works to deteriorate us mentally, emotionally, and physically. Sleep depends primarily on the proper utilization of 2 naturally created chemicals, melatonin and adenosine. Melatonin, despite its marketing as a sleeping pill, actually works at night as a sleep timing chemical. Melatonin runs our 24-hour circadian rhythm clock at night. In the average normally functioning adult, melatonin production begins increasing 3.5 to 5 hours before sleep is supposed to start. It'll generally peak about sleep onset time and continue for several hours before tapering off until 1 or 2 in the morning, when it basically stops. So, where do trauma, hyperarousal, and stress chemistry come in? Well, trauma memories stimulate hyperarousal 24/7, which increases stress chemistry levels 24/7. Stress chemistry inhibits the production and absorption of melatonin at night in the brain. When that happens, our brains don't get a strong enough signal that it is time to wind down for sleep. That's why we have trouble sleeping when we're stressed out or worried. The second sleep chemical, adenosine, is actually a byproduct of our activity level. The more energy our cells use, the more adenosine gets made and built up in the bloodstream. Now, it seems that as long as adenosine remains in the bloodstream, it doesn't have much effect. But when adenosine enters the brain and is digested by special receptors there, it makes our brain slow down, become groggy, and sleepy. The entry of adenosine into the brain and its digestion there appear to depend on a signal from nighttime melatonin. So, stress chemistry inhibited low melatonin signals means inadequate entry and digestion of adenosine in the brain at night, and we do not get optimally sleepy. In addition to this stress melatonin effect, the stress chemistry of hyperarousal also inhibits the entry and digestion of adenosine in the brain. This means that the worried, hyperaroused brain does not get slowed down enough for falling asleep or staying asleep easily. Furthermore, it's the continued entry and buildup of adenosine in the brain that takes us from shallow sleep to deep sleep, and then which holds us in sleep until the adenosine is digested out, usually after about 7.5 to 9 hours of sleep, and generally somewhere around sunrise. If the accumulated adenosine is not digested out in our brains during sleep before we wake up, we will be groggy. We will need stress chemistry to inhibit the undigested adenosine from being digested and continuing to make us sleepy. That is why so many people unwittingly set their alarms too late, put too much into their early morning schedules in order to create enough morning stress to keep the residual adenosine from being digested and making them groggy and sleepy. By the way, caffeine, also known as America's drug, chemically mimics stress chemistry and temporarily blocks adenosine from being digested in the brain and making you sleepy. But neither caffeine nor stress chemistry make accumulated and still accumulating adenosine go away. They just temporarily block it from being digested within the brain. That's part of why we so often slump during our workday when periods of low energy output and less stress occur. Lunch. It's also why many people get short sleep during the week, then crash and enter rebound sleep on weekends, or fall asleep at the wheel or on the couch during halftime. Staying in shallow sleep due to the inhibition of proper melatonin and adenosine action by stress chemistry, instead of entering deeper sleep, is especially damaging to our brains and bodies. It is during deep sleep that our brain's unique cleaning system operates. It's during deep sleep that our hormones do much of their production and balancing, our mental energy chemistry is refreshed, our human growth hormone and testosterone are produced and regulated, our cells are rebuilt, etc. So, impairing deep sleep processes is not good for a person. The role of supersized trauma memories in producing nightmares and their accompanying bursts of stress chemistry during sleep will be covered in more detail in another presentation. But for now, it's enough to know that sleep disruption in the form of nightmares is another way that a history of significant trauma and the living memories it creates interrupt and compromise negative sleep. Given all this, it should be little surprise then that hyperarousal and constantly elevated stress chemistry of insecure attachment and a brain overly full of trauma memories has such broad and deep effects on people and contributes to so many different mental and physical health problems. The literature on trauma, childhood adversity, insecure attachment, and other mental and physical health conditions clearly indicates that trauma and insecure attachment do not travel alone. I mean, even if a particular traumatic event begins its journey of adaptation in the brain alone, it will also generally find similar experiences and memories to hook up with and serve as new company along the way. The Vietnam veterans readjustment studies done back in the 1990s showed that 98.8% of Vietnam theater veterans with PTSD had at least one other diagnosable mental health condition. And another study around that time indicated that the most common number of these co-occurring mental health diagnoses was 3. Although science is just now fleshing out its understanding of how stress affects the body, what research we have indicates a similarly distressing picture between insecure attachment, trauma, and physical health. One study on people who developed PTSD after 9/11 showed that 95.8% of those who developed PTSD also developed an additional mental health condition, an additional physical health condition, or both. And by the way, none of those studies I just quoted use the more complete list of trauma-related co-occurring conditions, or otherwise known as comorbidities, that I'm about to give you. Mental health conditions associated with insecure attachment, a history of trauma, chronic hyperarousal or poor quality sleep include the following: depression and suicidality, substance abuse and dependence, sleep disorders and nightmares, chronic pain and increased pain sensitivity, dissociative disorders and symptoms, generalized anxiety, panic attacks, personality disorders, that is, antisocial, dependent, borderline, narcissistic, histrionic, etc. Eating disorders such as bulimia and anorexia, autism, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorders, premature cognitive decline, and a whole range of intellectual and learning issues, attention deficit and attention deficit hyperactivity disorders, impulse control disorders. That means basically there's around 23 conditions that seem to follow trauma, and that doesn't even include the PTSD. So basically 24 conditions. Now, what physical health conditions are associated with insecure attachment, a history of trauma, chronic hyperarousal, or poor sleep? Well, that list includes insulin resistance and other metabolic disorders such as type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, strokes, heart disease, slowed recovery from injuries and illnesses, immune system dysfunctions, allergies, inflammation, traumatic brain injuries and functional brain deficits, obstructive sleep apnea, cancer, lung disease and asthma, liver disease, skeletal fractures, dermatological conditions, gastrointestinal problems such as ulcers and irritable bowel syndrome, smoking, arthritis and rheumatism, epilepsy, and headaches. That comes out to over 25 conditions plus any injuries suffered in the trauma itself. Furthermore, all of those associated physical health conditions except epilepsy show what we call a dose-response relationship with cumulative trauma. What that means is the more trauma the individual had, the worse the condition was. It's pretty clear that these associated conditions, these comorbidities, really compromise and complicate so many aspects of a post-traumatically adapted person's life and their overall clinical picture. Not surprisingly, these associated comorbid conditions appear to have the same effect on treatment as on overall health. That is, more comorbidities, more associated conditions and symptoms present, means more intense symptoms for each condition present. That is the PTSD and, say, the depression or the alcohol abuse. It also means these comorbidities mean more likelihood of dropout in conventional PTSD treatment and less success with conventional PTSD treatments. The more comorbidity, the more associated conditions present, the harder PTSD is to treat and recover from overall. Now, I have to issue a however, and that is the book of my clinical experience asserts that if we treat the underlying causes of multiple trauma-associated conditions at once, say we focus on attachment issues, trauma memories, and hyperarousal, instead of simply using coping skills training to suppress one set of symptoms at a time, we can have much greater, much broader clinical success and healing. Furthermore, if one attempts to treat trauma and its comorbidities, one set of symptoms or one disorder with one treatment plan at a time, one after the other, which is actually the current scientific research and evidence-based treatment approach, the result is a very unwieldy regimen of treatment at best. I mean, just sticking with the 24 mental health diagnoses and symptoms that we just listed yields not just 24 separate conditions, but almost 17 million potential symptom and condition combinations which might require treatment. And even at the now standard brief 10 to 12 sessions per condition limit preferred by PTSD treatment researchers and PTSD research funding agencies, some of our clients would die of old age first. 17 million. That's a lot of one condition, one treatment script combinations. I mean, 24 is still a lot of potential treatment plan segments. In my opinion, the conventional treatment research approach is simply not a realistic or workable model for either treatment research or for treatment itself. As I keep implying and suggesting, we are best off focusing on the mutual underlying causes of associated multiple conditions, and then work on whatever habits or symptoms might remain after dealing substantially with the primary causes. And those primary causes, once again, are insecure attachment, trauma, hyperarousal, hypofrontality, and poor sleep. This extreme level of post-traumatic comorbidity, then, also has very serious implications for how we should be studying and conceptualizing treatments for multiple associated post-traumatic conditions at once, because single diagnosis PTSD, meaning PTSD only without any additional comorbidities, is actually a very rare occurrence. In fact, in our trauma recovery program at the Women's Federal Prison, our most common diagnostic picture was rarely just PTSD, and in fact, our diagnoses often did not even include PTSD. The single most common diagnostic impression was, in fact, some combination of depression, a substance abuse disorder, about 94.5%, and nightmares. Insecure attachment, when we were testing it, came in at 100% over 4 years. But insecure attachment was not and still is not an official diagnosis. Yet, single diagnosis PTSD subjects dominate the research samples for PTSD treatment. I'll speak about this much greater in an upcoming presentation, but what it essentially means is if we look at only include research subjects with PTSD only, and 98.8% have additional, comorbidities, that means that the vast bulk of PTSD research into treatment isn't valid. It does not apply to the vast majority of actual, real-life human beings with multiple trauma-associated conditions. Our next presentation will be about what I consider to be the 3 pillars of quality life. I also see these 3 pillars as both necessary and legitimate goals of comprehensive post-traumatic treatment. I doubt that many of you will be at all surprised at what I name as pillars, but naming the pillars and talking about them will give us a chance to put a lot of what we've already talked about into a more clear and cohesive understanding. As always, I hope that you have found this Straight Talk About PTSD presentation accurate, illuminating, and resonating with your experience. If you'd like to subscribe, just hit the subscribe button below. If you'd like to be notified of future Straight Talk About PTSD presentations as they're uploaded, please hit the bell icon as well. Again, thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time.